Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another session, another Zoom session, I would like to say. Sir, Millennium Mams believes in continuous learning, and we have been seriously investing in ourselves for the past 27 years, thanks to the tireless efforts of our mentors, Mr. Vishnu Dhanuka and Mr. Sanjay Bhavania. Sirs, are you there? Sir, if you could say hi to Sir.
Yes, hi. Yeah, we are there. Good to see.
And my colleague Sirish, she'll be handling the Q&A.
Yes.
Okay. So we have with us today someone who has the Herculean task of prescribing solutions for the Indian economy. Thank you, Mr. Subramanian, for addressing my team once again. Only few of us they got an opportunity to meet you at the iconic North Block, and today we have more than 300 members joining us from Kolkata, Bangalore, Mumbai, and many other cities. Millennium Mams is following social distancing but ensuring sessions are in full swing. As continuous learners, we respect the safety measures but have taken the route to ensure we raise the bar. MM is giving back to society through our philanthropic Sahयोग by providing essential supplies to the underprivileged sections of Nadia and Sundarban districts. Our guest of today has a academic career, having done his engineering from IIT Kanpur, MBA from IIM Kolkata, and a PhD from University of Chicago Booth School of Business, where Dr. Raghuram Rajan was his mentor. Mr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian is an Indian economist and the current Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. He is also an associate professor at the Indian School of Business and executive director at its Center for Analytical Finance. He has had an illustrious career, having worked with SEBI, RBI, ICICI Bank, to name a few. We welcome the young and dynamic Krishnamurthy Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Sir, we are really privileged to have you today amidst us, and it's another brilliant opportunity for us to open up on a knowledge sharing platform. Now, I would like to request you to share your views with our members and for Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Rachna. Am I audible?
Absolutely.
Yeah, just to quickly, a small correction. I do not use any executive capacity, executive role with the.
All of you, please be on mute. Please be on mute.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to correct that I do not hold any executive capacity.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. So I stand corrected.
And can we have others actually just mute, because I think it's disturbing. Yes. Talking, and that just affects the train of thought.
Yeah. So everyone has to be on mute. Please take care that you have muted yourself. And the others, please be on mute. Sir, Dhanuka sir is also there. Sir, if you could say hi to Mr. Subramanian.
Good afternoon, sir.
Very good afternoon.
Yes.
Very good afternoon. Yeah. So yeah, let me start again. Actually, I do not hold any executive position, and it's been a long while since I was an associate professor. That was many years back. So I'm now a professor. Just to clarify. This particular episode that all of us are going through, I think it's fair to say that none of us would have lived through uncertain times like this ever before. Any of us has even lived through a war before. So I think most of us would have been born after the 1971 war, which was the last large-scale war that India indulged in. So in some sense, we are really in really virgin territory And it's the same for people like us who have to actually make assessments of, how the economy is going to pan out, what should be the steps that should be taken. So we are also very much on virgin territory, and using our thinking apparatus to think about, what is in store ahead of us, and what should be the strategy. So it's informative though, and this is something my approach has always been to use data, even in uncertain times like these, to use data to guide our thinking. So one of the episodes that can be quite informative for us, during this time is the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which so far remains the most dangerous episode ever. And hopefully we will not be rewriting history, and the 1918 Spanish flu will continue to be the most devastating pandemic ever. Just to give you some numbers, in the Spanish flu episode, 1/3 of the entire population, world's population, was infected, and the rate of mortality in the Spanish flu was 10%, which means 1 in every 10 individuals that was infected, had to suffer the unfortunate consequence of death. In contrast, and just so that we actually have a reasonably, accurate perspective, compared to 1/3 of the population being infected right now, less than 1%, note the number again, 1/3 with the Spanish flu, which is about 33.3%, and less than 1% of the population is infected today. Number two, while the mortality rate was 10%, in the case of Spanish flu, it is 3.4% on average with COVID-19. So the mortality rate is also 1/3 of the average mortality rate that prevailed with the Spanish flu. But in terms of the spread, and this is a parameter that epidemiologists use very, very often, which is what this parameter called R0. Many of you would have read about it, which captures if a person is infected, how many more people is he or she likely to infect. That parameter is called R0. That parameter for the Spanish flu was between 2 and 2.2. For COVID, epidemiologists have estimated it to be 2.4. So they're in the same range. While for the, and just as contrast, for the common flu, the R0 is about between 1.2 to 1.3. The common influenza that comes every year, especially in advanced economies. Smallpox or Ebola, for them the R0 is in excess of 3.5. So the Spanish flu episode is therefore a very reasonable proxy to understand what happened, and which can then be a guide for policy for us as well. One key, I think one very, very key learning from the Spanish flu episode is this. Lot of people, and economists included, have talked about this trade-off that if you take stringent measures to to slow down the pandemic, flatten the curve for the pandemic, there is a cost for the economy. There is, I think, and as we are seeing, with the lockdown, there is. But what research in the case of the Spanish flu seems to clearly show is that while there may be a trade-off in the short run, once you look at a long run, a reasonable 1.5 year period, actually there is no trade-off. In fact, policies that indeed help save lives are the policies that also help in economic recovery once the pandemic is over. And this is research that's been conducted showing that counties in the United States, which counties are by the way equivalent of districts in India, those counties that implemented the most intensive measures, like lockdowns, which is school closures, church closures, shopping centers being closed, etc. Which is the national lockdown that we've had is actually just a very intensive version of the kind of steps that were taken by counties. And what is very clear is that in those counties where the county administration took early steps, which is to lock down early and continued for longer, the mortality rates were lower, and at the same time, the economic revival was also greater. So this is very important, for us to keep in mind as we think about the one more, aspect that many of you may think that, oh, is it what happened in the Spanish flu 100 years back? And see anything about for the United States, does it have any relevance for India? It's a legitimate question that may arise. A question that came to our mind as well. And what we've seen is that the United States of 1918 was very similar to India of today. Just to give you some parameters, per capita GDP was about $8,500 for the United States in 1918. Ours is close to $7,000. Urban population was about 40% for the United States then, between 40 to 45%. For India, different estimates. Some estimates put it at 35%. Other estimates put it close to 50%. So proportion of urban population actually, very similar. Agriculture was far more in the United States of 1918. About 20% of all economic activity there was agriculture. In India, it's 15%. Services, the presence of services was less there than India. Manufacturing just about similar. So in terms of the macro parameters, the US economy of the 1918, 1920s actually was very similar to what India is today, and therefore the learnings from there can be very, very useful. The other part, which actually, and this is something which all of us have to keep in mind, which is this comes from some of the insights gathered from behavioral economics. In times like these, all of us, it's legitimate for us to be scared, to be fearful, and that's just a very human, notion. And I think at an individual level, for us, each one of us are individuals, us as individuals and our families, we should be scared and we should take all precautions, because absent some of that fear, we may actually take things easy. But when one looks at the national level, driving policy may not necessarily be the right thing, because, and this is what behavioral economics highlights, all of us are subject to what is called saliency bias, which is the fact that we may take evidence of just the last few last few months, or we may put far more weightage on what has happened in the last couple of months, just extrapolate from there and say this is how the world is going to be in the next in this year, which may not actually be the case. And that is why what happened 100 years back is something that I'm actually bringing to your attention. So in terms of the sectors that may be impacted, obviously sectors, service sectors will be impacted far more, because in service sectors, think about tourism, for instance, or in even more let's say massage services as an example. Now these involve actually far more human interaction, touch, and which may be very, very dangerous during these times. And so none of us is likely to go and sort of go for a session of massage, for instance, or travel on for a tourist vacation. So the demand for these kind of activities, especially service sector activities, is quite likely therefore to come down. Similarly, it's also possible that if some of us, let's say we're thinking of buying a car maybe, or investing in a house, many of us will say, why don't we actually keep the money for now, see how things pan out, maybe 6-8 months. Once the pandemic is over, then we might decide to actually go for such discretionary consumption. So discretionary consumption, again, actually the demand for that will be lower. So I think the main effect that the COVID episode demand for, for basically non-essential services and non-essential, goods, and or more sort of discretionary spending. Second effect could be actually on the supply side, which is because workers are, maybe especially those sectors which rely more on, on migrant workers, they may face some difficulties in production, and labor, may be possibly at short availability, which may affect the supply side as well. So, but the demand side is far more, likely to be intensive than the supply side. So overall, I think the impact will be there on the service sector far more. And in that sense, there may be something that India has to watch out for, given our given our comparative advantage in the services sector. Of course, this year I think GDP growth will be affected. Q1, I think Q1 of this year will certainly be I think the worst over I think last 25 years, and that's not unanticipated or unexpected because of the unprecedented episode that we are going through. Q2 may be better, and then Q3 and Q4 we can expect it to be things to improve. So overall, I think there will be a decline in GDP growth, and some sectors will be affected more than others. But the kind of sentiment that has prevailed, especially against some countries, without naming them, I think those can be opportunities for India, and these in the government is working very closely to utilize those. In the economic survey that was released in January of this year, we had deep dived into some of these opportunities, especially, for instance, Assemble in India for the World, and those might be important opportunities. The government is also looking at this as a way of implementing reforms, the important reforms. The government is working on a stimulus package as well. I think, and I'll stop my introductory comments with this set of thoughts, which is, many of you might have read about on social media or on print media that there are countries like the United Kingdom which are giving stimulus packages of 15% of GDP, or 20% of GDP. I think got to be more careful with these numbers. These 15% of GDP, just specifically for the United Kingdom, what is called the Rishi Sunak package, is actually not quite right. And just as a side comment, by the way, after that, that press conference where he basically announced a 15% of GDP, he's been completely absent, and not answering any questions, because the details are actually not as flowery or flattering as 15%, especially because that 15% of GDP involved 350 billion pounds of loans that were guaranteed, and we all know very well that if there is a loan, it's not going to be 350 billion pounds. It's going to be a fraction of that. At max it may be about 35 billion pounds. So the actual number is not 15% of GDP, it is 3.7% of GDP. So that's the first thing to keep in mind when you actually evaluate, is the Indian government doing enough? When you look at these statistics, take them with basically not a pinch of salt, but buckets of salt, and then, make your comparison. Second aspect that needs to be kept in mind is that compared to advanced economies whose tax to GDP ratios are far greater because their tax bases are much deeper, India doesn't have that luxury, and even for a government, money does not grow on trees. So much like a household has to actually keep its, its expenditure, keep, by making sure that the expenditure is not too far away from the revenues. I think the same consideration has to prevail for, for an economy as well. Given our tax to GDP ratios and given our sovereign rating, I think, we have to be realistic in our expectations. Last point I will make is that, especially in a country like India, we have to, and I think all of you will be very sympathetic to this idea, is, between people like us, supporting people like us and people who are actually far, far more vulnerable, I think the government has to actually focus on supporting the more vulnerable, and that is just remembering Gandhiji's talisman, which is that whenever we think about policy, we basically think about the Daridra Narayan, and that's Gandhiji used to use for that talisman. Policies have to actually be focused on them, because people like us, we will be able to brave the lockdown whichever way. We'll have enough savings to dip into, or our own networks and friends, etc., to help. But the vulnerable sections don't. So I think this is also something that we have to remember. And I don't think I can put this in any better way than by, and people like you have to then take the mantle in sort of advocating this. There's no better way of putting this than by using a very powerful shloka from the Bhagavad Gita. It's in chapter 3, shloka 21. Shri Krishna says, Yad yad acharati shreshtatah tat tat evetaro janah tayat pramadam kurute lokastad anuvartite. Yad yad acharati shreshtatah. Acharan is behavior. Yad yad acharati shreshtatah. Shresht is people like you. Those who are looked up. Yad yad acharati shreshtatah tat tat evetaro janah. Janah is basically people who are less privileged. Sayat pramanam kurute. Praman, which is basically not just talk, but the proof of action that we give. Sayat pramanam kurute lokas tad anuvartate. That is, people basically, lokas, follow that. And that is basically, so it's beholden on people like us to be that praman for behavior and basically for children as well. And with that, let me just, bring to a stop what I had to share. Happy to take questions.
Wow. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yes, Sirisha.
Thank you very much for the address, sir. I'll be taking the question answer session forward. At the outset, on behalf of my organization, I'd like to thank Honorable Prime Minister and his extremely able forces. We are part of those, to have taken very stringent and quick measures to contain the spread of crisis. So this is a Black Swan event, and you are in the helm of affairs. So I just want to know that you'll have a great story to tell tomorrow, but then when you get up in the morning, do you say, challenge accepted?
Very good question. So, and if I sound, arrogant when I say this, please correct me. That's not the intention. But I've always been someone who has embraced challenges. Just to give you, I don't think I can give you a better example. When I just finished class 10th in CBSE, I was actually I just barely got first class, sort of 67% in class 10th. And from there, then I basically, when we had people who had 90%, etc., and they were scared of taking the IIT JEE, even with 67%, I said, I can take on the IIT JEE. And as it turned out, I actually was a top ranker in the examination. So, and I think that is just, I have never run away from challenges, and partly because, I think I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to my late father, who, insisted on me, even with my tuta-futa Sanskrit initially when I was learning, to, he would make me read the Bhagavad Gita to him. And I think there is no better manual for situations like this, which is, do your duty. I'm just trying to do my best, do my dharma, and then, let the results are never in my hands, never in anybody's hands. Actually, I think results are given by the Almighty. So I don't get stressed, because stress means I'm actually just taking too much of, in some sense my own, my ego of saying, oh, I'm the one who's doing it. Finally, we're all basically instruments for the divine.
Brilliant. Thank you, sir. So the only side effect of positive attitude is that it is contagious. And thank you.
Oh, the second question.
So,
The foundation of my organization is based on Bhagavad Gita, and our mentor, Mr. Dhanuka, he took special classes on Gita, and we are the lucky ones to be attending his classes.
Please,
so if I may ask you,
I'm tired.
request everyone to mute, please. So if I may ask you about the downfalls of our economy.
Please take care.
I can't hear the question.
Yes. So am I audible? Yeah. So I was just putting the focus on the dark horse of the economy, which is agriculture sector. Now, it's of course Anuja's question. India resides in the villages, and we are luckily blessed with good monsoons. Do you think agriculture sector will come off as a dark horse? Because once you take care of logistics and procurement, if the government upsets and the logistics, hello.
Yeah, I lost you in between, because
Yes.
in between.
Yes. So I'll repeat the question. Do you believe that agriculture sector can come out as a dark horse out of this crisis? We are going to have a good monsoon. If we up the ante in procurement and logistics, do you think this can be a great value addition to the GDP, which is now very minimal? This question is from Anuja.
So actually, I quite agree with the sentiment that, agriculture can be the dark horse, but agriculture can be the dark horse not by upping the ante on procurement, but by scaling down the ante substantially on procurement. And what I mean by that is, doing away with a lot of the restrictions that we place and the subsidies, inefficient and inequitous subsidies that we give, in agriculture. So, for instance, the MSP operations end up benefiting the rich farmers in Haryana, Punjab, Western Uttar Pradesh far more than the farmers who are not as rich. Even the power subsidy, for that matter, fertilizer subsidy ends up going and subsidizing and supporting highly inefficient companies, fertilizer companies. So the way the agriculture sector can actually be, can emerge as a dark horse is by calling calling out some of these subsidies and taking out the APMC, for instance, the restrictions that are there, enabling more competition, letting the market forces come in more, on the agriculture side.
Right. Thank you. So, China. I mean, the biggest topic of today is China. A lot of countries want to move away from manufacturing from China, and they're looking for options. And if I'm not wrong, our Honorable Prime Minister had, stressed on his LinkedIn post as well that India will be, a big beneficiary of this. So this question comes from Shweta Singhal. How do you think? If you could share the roadmap with us as to how it's going to happen?
I think this is an excellent question. I actually alluded to it partly in my remarks.
You did.
Yes. So, but I guess by responding to this question, I have actually let the cat out of the bag. be that as it may, I think the opportunity is certainly there, and as I was saying earlier as well, we can really focus on attracting global value chains out of China. I think there's an important fact that we should keep in mind. Unlike portfolio, investments, which is money that comes in, either into equity markets or debt markets, or world over. If you see, there is a lot of diversification that investors do, foreign investors. They put money across various countries. They don't, put all their eggs into one basket. But when it comes to trade, multinational enterprises have not diversified enough. They've put, most of their eggs into one basket. Now, I think this particular episode, this Black Swan event, has highlighted the risks of lack of diversification. Therefore, there is an important opportunity for India, because India is the country that can offer a market and a labor force that is, as deep as, as some of the existing countries. So there is definitely a significant opportunity for India. And that's, I would refer you to the economic survey, where, this is, I think, I remember right, the fifth chapter of the economic survey this year's January, where we've actually outlined a very clear strategy. And those of you who, as entrepreneurs, are interested in utilizing this opportunity, I think you may benefit from, having a close look at that chapter.
So the next question comes from Namita. And you drew a parallel between, of course, the swine flu and COVID crisis, right? So, but the other crisis in terms of, revamping of the policies, we seem to draw a parallel between 1991 crisis and now. So is this a great time to speed up some of the policies?
Absolutely. I think, from the perspective of reform, yes, 1991 is a good example. But there are important differences, I think, which we should keep in mind. See, the 1991 crisis was very much self-inflicted. We basically had a very high fiscal deficit, inflation was high, remittances basically started drying out completely, and therefore the current account came under huge pressure. All of which was the policies that we had followed for about 45 years, the ineffective policies that we had followed till then, which is what brought us to 1991. This, though, is clearly outside shock, exogenous shock, which is, but it's a crisis, albeit, and therefore, because India oftentimes reforms better in a crisis than otherwise, it's certainly an opportunity.
Thank you. So there's one pertinent question which everyone is asking, which is on the immigrant labor migration, which is, generally, what is your view on the strategy to get them back to normalcy? What is this crisis? I mean, how is it going to pan out, or how do you, as policymakers, look at this crisis?
See, one thing I want you to actually be sort of cognizant of the challenge with migrant workers, which is that these are workers that their permanent addresses is somewhere else in another state, and they live elsewhere. So being able to identify them is very hard. And suppose just as a thought experiment, suppose we said that, let's say, two of the two cities that have the maximum amount of migrant workers, which is one is Thane and second is Pune in Maharashtra. So these are the two cities. The 2011 census shows as data shows that these are the two cities that have the maximum number of migrant labor. Now, suppose we basically said that, let's say, given the number of migrant labor, take the number of people multiplied by 25 kgs of let's say rice, and give it to the PDS shop to deliver it. Okay. Now, what will happen? because there is no record of these migrant workers. Shop will say, "अरे साहब दे दिया सारा, सबको दे दिया, आपने जितने migrant workers हैं सबको बांट दिया actually, and he may very well just sell it to a hotel or maybe pocket it or sell it somewhere else, and without basically the database of knowing where that this is, it will not reach the migrant workers, and it will only encourage corruption. And as it is, we all know very well that the PDS is a relic, and and is incredibly corrupt. So it's not easy, therefore, to think about a way of targeting it. What we are doing though is, that's why working on portability of the ration card. Once the ration card is portable, then you can log in and find out whether this is a proper BPL worker, BPL family. It can be used, and this is using this opportunity to speed up that reform. But in the meanwhile, we're also been working on getting the Aadhaar numbers of those that are in government-run camps for Aadhaar for migrant workers, so that can be used to, because you can't just do blindly saying let's give it out here, right? So it will just lead to a lot of I mean, government resources will be spent, but it will not reach the end person either. So these are the practical challenges that one faces when having to administer policy. But I will say the following, which is, while there is no question that the migrant workers need to be taken care of, I would actually want to put this point across, that suppose a crisis like 5 years back, even just 5 years back, the amount of, and if we had to do a lockdown, the distress would have been orders of magnitude higher, because without Jan Dhan, right, the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, mobile trinity would not have been, you wouldn't have been able to operate that. And so there is no way, you'll have had to physically dispense stuff, and that would have had its own sets of inefficiencies. The amounts that are going into people's accounts now, direct benefit transfer that is happening, all that has been possible only through the Jan Dhan. So I think that's a very good example of how the IT infrastructure has enabled welfare, and same thing can be carried over to the migrant workers as well. But that needs some more work.
Thank you so much, sir. This is the, I think, last question. It's from Sonali Sonpal, and she says that global GDP will be muted, or in her words, will crash. Now, India is a domestic-driven economy, and we have two advantages. We are import-heavy, and we are consumer-based economy. So, don't you see this phenomena guiding us going future, and how is this going to pan out? And if this is correct, then isn't it a good phenomena to be propagated to create confidence amongst Indians?
That's a good point. Though, what you have to remember though is that because this is a health pandemic, suppose and just as a thought experiment, suppose the same same episode had happened just for purely economic reasons, where the rest of the world was going to, GDP was going to crash. India basically would have been able to, exploit that advantage far better, the advantages that you're talking about. But because we are also having to do our own sets of measures, social distancing, etc., the consumption, domestic consumption also gets impacted. Of course, once we emerge out of this, it's possible, India, and I think I do agree that India can be in a better position compared to other economies. But as of now, we are affected as well, even though the number of cases are much lower. But the worry is we are a much bigger population, and and so we have to be extra careful, because we don't have the health infrastructure, the resources to be able to take care of large number of people, getting infected. So that's in some sense, between this trade-off between, life and the economy, the government is placing greater weightage on human life, and that's something which is important at this point.
Right.
Absolutely.
Sure, we can take more questions, no?
Yeah, one or two more questions.
Yes.
350.
Yes, we can. So there is a question which says that you had mentioned about the invisible hand and the hand of trust working together for the growth of economy. How should these two come together at this point of time?
Question. See, the invisible hand of trust. Invisible hand of trust is something which is very important at this point in time. If you think about the broader idea, in terms of the invisible hand of trust, which is that we basically, as a society, we trust each other and do what is right for the society as a whole, not just what is right for us as individuals. And now, in fact, in some sense, if we do something that is good for us as individuals, it's good for society as well, which is if we basically take care of, wear a mask, socially distance ourselves, it's good for us. At the same time, it's also good for the society. And therefore, there is this opportunity for us to build social capital, build more trust, in our society, and thereby, enhance the hand of trust. See, the invisible hand of markets, is important in whether it's times like this or normal times, because, in India, we've generally not respected the invisible hand of markets enough, despite the fact that, as we showed very clearly, our spiritual ethos, our economic ethos, our philosophical ethos was always one of supporting greater hand role for the markets. But we went through a phase because of particular leaders whom we had, who were so enamored by just everything that the West did, and so ended up just copying, and so we ended up basically in some sense the tryst with destiny that we were promised never got delivered because of the tryst with socialism.
Wow.
So there is a question on the recent crisis. So
Actually, maybe the last question.
yeah, the recent crisis on the money. Someone wants to know if the money would like to, if it's safe in our money safe in banks, or government is likely to dip to the FDs to see through the financial crisis. No, basically. No.
This is India is a country where property rights are very well respected. There's no way that everybody's money is safe. Where is this question even coming?
Yeah, actually. So yes, sir. Last question, of course. Biggest concern for the economy right now before you sign off.
Concern for the economy, I think, at this point is actually how do we open up the economy while taking care of the health concerns as well. That's what's a soft path for us to actually get back to. That's the biggest concern at this point.
Thank you so much, Rashmi. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And they were invaluable takeaways. And what I would say that it's a big opportunity for India, and it's a blessing in disguise, I would say, although so much of things are happening around. But crisis has always brought about opportunity, and I'm sure we're at the helm, with our Honorable Finance Minister, Honorable Prime Minister, and you taking decisions, we are sure, and we always see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think the takeaways which we had today, it was the best insight we've had in these times in light of COVID. So thank you so much for giving your valuable time to us and addressing so many questions. And we look forward to interacting with you sometime here in Calcutta. So we would like to host you in Calcutta after after the dust settles down. Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah. Nishchay, sir. It will be a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Excellent session. Thank you so much for the opportunity. We love this.
Thank you.